Welcome to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church.
Well, friends, welcome to the Means of Grace podcast. And my name is Rob Hutchinson. I'm the Director of Church Development for the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. And joining me today on a segment called Church is Changing is Andres Perez Gonzalez. He is the Student Associate Minister at Guilford College, United Methodist Church in Greensboro. Welcome, Andreas.
Hey, Rob. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. As we get started, tell me a little bit about what Student Associate Minister means.
Well, it basically means that I'm a student and I do associate ministry. I'm a student at Duke Divinity School. A lot of people think that because I'm a student associate minister that I work directly with students. I don't, although sometimes I do interact with students, but my role in the church and the pastoral team goes more towards planting a new faith community, particularly reaching out to the Hispanic population in Greensboro. So I guess the title speaks more about my position rather than what I do. But yeah, that's the one they gave me, so I took it.
That's great. So this is a project in partnership and collaboration with the Office of Church Development. So we are looking at planting a new faith community, and this faith community is anchored at Guilford College. You said it was originally for reaching out to Hispanic communities. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And I know you've talked about not being limited to that, but would you mind just speaking to that real quick?
I think what happened is when I landed in Greensboro and I started just getting to know people and understanding a little bit more about the dynamics, there's a big gap between first, second, third generation immigrants where you have some people who identify as Hispanic or Latino, Latina, who just don't really speak Spanish anymore. So when you say that it's a Spanish-speaking faith community, to me, it just sounds like you're leaving some people out, and we don't want to do that. So I'm trying to find ways to do both and to approach more people who identify as Hispanic rather than who speak Spanish or not. And also as the church looks and turns more multi-ethnic, we're trying to be aware of that and just intentional in not limiting ourselves to saying we are this one thing, but rather we are part of this kingdom that has no borders and colors and faces, but it works through those things, but is not limited by those things or bounded by.
Right. As we get to converse over the next 25 minutes, what might be one thing you would hope people listen for that could be universal to everybody, whether they're in a neighborhood that might have, multiple cultures around them, or, if they're in a mostly Anglo area, or that's what their church is kind of focused on? What's one thing they might want to be listening for here in the next 20 minutes? Because we're talking about, this is something for everybody. This isn't just about a multicultural church plant.
Right. I guess if it were just down to my last words, I would love to tap into the idea that we as a church are not complete if we don't have each other. And sometimes that means stepping out of our comfort zone or our things that ethnically or racially we're bounded by, and just seeing Jesus through the other, reaching out, keep reaching out. I think that's a good church mantra. We need to keep reaching out to people that are not like us.
Yeah. Amen. So Bev Cockley, the district superintendent at Northern Piedmont, and I and Jeremy at Guilford College, we had a Zoom interview with you. It was probably about a year ago now. And I told people afterwards that this is the best interview I've had with another person for a job in my 30 years of ministry. And I told you that afterwards, and you said, well, why? Well, not that we can recreate or need to recreate that interview, but I want folks to hear a little bit about your background and where you're coming from and why it's so important, for your perspective here as we continue to do ministry in the South and the Bible Belt, which is different than a lot of places around the country. And so one of the things that we talked about was this idea of doing ministry in a post-Christian world. Tell me, just as we get into that, tell me about where you came from with the 4 years that you served before you came to Greensboro. Tell us a little bit about what you were doing before that.
So I was born and raised in Mexico, in the city of Monterrey. It's a 2-hour shot to the border when you're driving. And it's not a border town, but it sort of feels like it in terms of like influence and just how Americanized we are compared to other places in Mexico. So I was born and raised there. My dad's a pastor. I was sort of like in and out of church growing up, interested and not interested, and then interested again, and then really interested and like going to seminary type of level interest. And I did 4 years of seminary in the John Wesley Methodist Seminary in Mexico. And then I actually kept doing worship pastoring and youth pastoring and some other things. And I also worked as a translator in the marketplace and did a lot of, it was this really cool startup company that was just doing cool things. And I did that for 5 years, got married. We decided to do something different. And we moved to Vancouver, Canada, which was like 4,000 something miles away. Our parents and family remind us of that all the time. Like it was really far. And I went to Canada to do graduate school and ended up doing more pastoring. And that sort of became my main thing, I guess, working there. But it was a really formative and cool experience working in British Columbia. I served as a worship pastor, a discipleship pastor, and eventually an associate pastor in a church over there. And this church was sort of in the process of, I guess not sort of, it was really in the process of revitalizing and a lot of change from within. In many ways, I think it's harder than planting because you have to restart and change culture and change minds and wrestle through a lot and do it in a Jesus-centered way. But I came in when they were just about to like do the big things, like we're going to take the pews out and people are going to lose it. Yeah, it was just a really cool, formative experience. Obviously, COVID hit during that time, so that made it like 1,000 times crazier. But yeah, this was a church that sort of realized like our bank account is full, but our younger people are all gone because of work and just pluralist society, and just some have deconstructed from their faith. And we have a bunch of elderly who are very faithful and very giving and are holding the church together, but our mid-generation's gone. So now we just have high schoolers and like no kid. And they had money to survive for maybe like 10 years. They're still there. And a church family that we hold very close to our hearts.
That sounds a lot like a lot of the churches here in Western North Carolina too, of in that kind of same space. You know, we're still alive, we're still here, we still have resources and people, but we can see, or it's difficult sometimes to see what's ahead. And yeah, obviously why we're talking about churches changing. So tell me a little bit about the difference between, you know, the culture in Vancouver and the culture here in North Carolina. You know, it's at a different point of, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, of because progression is not the right word, but just, you know, our natural evolving as a society. It is, you know, officially described as a post-Christian society. Can you tell me a little bit what that means?
Yeah, I think the first main difference is that I might be a little off on the numbers, but last time I checked, British Columbia, the province has like a 32% of people who identify as Christians, whereas North Carolina is still up on the high 70s. So that in itself is a big change in terms of how culture works and just how quick people are to say yes or no to an invitation of let's go to church. And very contrary to my experience in Mexico, which I guess Mexico feels more like the North Carolina type of, like the South in some ways. People are still religiously connected to something. Vancouver feels very pluralistic, where people are just or not interested or just deeply disconnected or maybe even hurt and disappointed by religion to the point where they don't really want to have anything to do with it. And maybe will come out of curiosity, but it's a very type of cautionary, like I just want to go see what's going on. There's not that need of, I need to go to church. The roots thing is gone. So it's hard. I think it's probably the hardest place where I've had to do ministry. So it's also been the most beautiful and rewarding experience of my life.
So going back real quick so, you know, 30% identify as Christian. So what does that translate to, you know, the percentage of people who actually are actively, regularly going to church on?
I mean, that's a good question. But I mean, if you just follow trends of how many people go to church, how many people are committed, how many people tithe, then we have a problem. We're probably hitting something like 12 to 14%. And the other thing is it does feel more alarming in how you would hear of churches closing every week type of deal. And this was before COVID, where, oh, this church is closing. Oh, this church has 100 people. They've decided to call it quits. And they're replanting because, you know, they just can't do it anymore. And this was happening like across the street from us. I remember when I was in seminary, Justo Gonzalez came down to Mexico and he gave this talk and he said, one day you're going to knock on people's door and you're going to ask, do you know who Jesus is? And the problem is they're going to say yes. But the idea that they're going to have is going to be very different from the one their neighbor has. And Jesus is going to become this kind of pluralistic concept where we're all going to have different concepts and ideas of who Jesus is. And it's going to be a problem trying to get us all together in a room and talking about this one person. And I think that I saw that in Canada, where everyone had like maybe preconception of who Jesus was. And my experience over there was doing ministry was more about building community rather than doing evangelism type of deal. There was a lot of inviting people to belong before they believed and creating space for people to wrestle with their faith and do that in a place where they felt loved and embraced. It's the first time where I had someone in my worship team who didn't believe in God, but wanted to be there and wanted to participate. And I saw one of my friends, still close, he got baptized 6 months later, but he came in saying, I don't even know if I should be here. Like, can I play the guitar? I don't believe in the songs, but I like the music. It's just like, yeah, you can, there's space for you here, there's space for you to wrestle, but you translate that to some of like the Bible Belt Christianity. And like, well, why would you have someone on your worship team who doesn't really believe in Jesus? Well, because there's no people who want to be on the worship teams anymore. So you can't see the solution if you don't have the problem yet. And right. I think that's one of the reasons why people are not 100% aware of what's coming in some ways. And I don't want this to sound like a prophetic type, like post-Christendom is coming. No, it's like, it is here. It's everywhere. I was thinking back, there's a Sufjan Stevens interview on Pitchfork where he talked about a post-God society. And this is like 2014 or something. And they asked him, are you a Christian? He's, well, I guess in a post-Christian society, why not? I guess I still am a Christian. And I think in many ways, the West Coast is ahead on that game. And not that it's a competition, but it's just how things are moving over there. And I felt grateful to be exposed to that. It was formative in many ways.
So as you engage, with our current culture and are looking to, be planning a new faith community, what might be, your top 2 or 3 strategies, knowing, the experience you had in Vancouver, it's a different culture and we know that context always rules. And so we adjust to the context we're in. So in this context that you are seeking to be a planter in today's world in Greensboro, what are the 2 or 3 top strategic things that you believe are going to be most important here in the next couple of years?
I think the most important one for me personally, for my mental health and the well-being of myself and my family, is understanding that this doesn't depend on me as much as it depends on what Jesus is already doing in Greensboro. So being aware and having a good, let's call it holy intuition of what God is doing in my surroundings is key, I think, to have a good ministry. I don't want to call it a successful ministry because I think that word doesn't really work, but you're having a ministry where the failures and successes work for the kingdom. Gustavo Gutierrez, Liberation Theologian, had this quote about seeds of liberation planted on the ground that God has laid for us to find. I think being plugged into the community in a way that allows us to discover what God is already doing is key for a good ministry, and the one that I'm hoping to foster and cultivate in Greensboro. So that's the first thing. And I think there are many ways to foster that. A prayer, walking through the calendar, living that cycle in a Jesus-centered way, I think allows me to be aware of those things or become aware of those things in some ways. So spiritual practices are important for me, and being intentional and aligning those with what is God doing in my community and how can I help, rather than how can I impose my 3-step, I want to plant a church idea. A community that's not even mine yet because I'm new here. And right. I want to respect the space of the people who have been here way before I have.
Yeah. So just, tying that up, some of the first steps that we talk about are stages of planting, both whether it's an intentional faith community or whether it's a fresh expression, intentionally outside of the church walls in the community. Deep listening is the number one step, which is really what you described, particularly from the spiritual side, deep listening for what God is already doing. And then I heard you talk about, being in the community and listening to what people's needs are. So that deep listening, sounds like you're rooted in that as you begin the work that you've done. And, you and I could talk a bunch more. I've already heard some of the ways that you're doing that in some real tangible ways of, the intentional conversations that you're having with people, both inside the church and outside at the same time, and listening for, where God's at work at that. So, all right. So that number one is this really listening for God, listening for what God's doing in the community around you. All right. So you're about to say, what was the second one?
The second one, and I'll say about the first one that I have been reading Luke's email, so I'm probably ripping him off here and there. But yeah, that's the first one, deep listening. The second one that I'm discovering this as I go is I sit with people, and usually I'll ask him a couple of questions, but usually it's just one question is, who are you and how did you become this person? And I've been just blown away by this to the point where I come home and I feel like I've changed. I sit with Ari and with my wife and I tell her a bit about what I've learned just sitting with people and how their stories have impacted me. And I keep thinking to myself, if we as a church can center the stories of the people that are not like us, we will be transformed by the way that the Holy Spirit is working through them in our communities. And I think if we can find a way to do ministry by centering people's stories, we will see our churches change. But change is difficult and it takes time and it can be scary. But I think we are at a place where, like you're saying, like the title of this podcast, the church is changing and change can be good. It means that we're not dead. So I think centering people's stories and also creating space for people to be able to come and feel safe and be challenged and find a sort of sanctuary where they can grow is key. So I want this community to really have that as a DNA where people can come and say, this is a place where I can be myself and I can be heard and tell my story and learn from other people's stories as well. I think church culture just assumes that we know that everyone has sort of the same conversion story, but I think we still need to learn a lot from those who are not where we are. And that changes even the way that we approach things like Lent, like Ash Wednesday. You have one community that's gearing itself for abnegation and fasting and putting themselves through a desert in a way to remember how Jesus went 40 days of fasting. And then you have another community that's more like Hispanic community that's been living in a desert for 15, 20 years now and have been fasting because, well, maybe they don't have enough money to buy all the things that they crave. And the way that we celebrate Ash Wednesday is different because one needs more of a recognition of Jesus is walking with you in the desert, and the other needs a recognition of maybe you need to come and follow Jesus more into the desert.
Yeah. So I'm hearing you kind of a thread in here is, as you're beginning, you're looking for God's story in the world where God's already showing up, God coming to life literally, and whether other people recognize it or not, but you as a minister and a pastor, part of that task of ministry is looking for where God's already at work, where God's story is already coming to life. And then I heard you is in your process as you get to know people is looking and listening and asking about their own story, whether it intersects with God's or not, but really knowing who people are and where they're starting from. And then, going back to something you said before about, the community building, is one of those key starting places. It seems like in the midst of community building, those stories are just going to naturally start to intertwine, as the Spirit, starts doing what the Spirit does best. I've usually found over the years, it's Spirit does what the Spirit does best when I get out of the way. And I hear you doing that all the time. That's really cool. So we got listening and looking for where God is, really listening to people and coming alongside them, hearing their story. What might be another step or strategy that you're looking at?
Another strategy that I think can really work in a place like Greensboro is, and everywhere I think really, but this is going to sound weird, but getting over ourselves a little bit as a church and understanding that we don't have all the answers, and two, we don't have all the reach. And we need to partner with non-church organizations to better serve the community. And this is one step that I'm just now tapping into, but it's connecting with people in my community who may not be connected to church or ministry, but who are devoting their lives to help the communities that I'm trying to serve, and partnering with them and saying, how can I help? What can I do? And just learning from their experience and learning from their insight, not in a capitalizing type of way where I want to take their research and apply it to my ministry, but in a real honest and type of partnership approach of saying, how can I help you do what you do better? And one of the things that I'm learning looking at some of the other ministries around the area that are doing good things, and particularly in Atlanta, we were just with Rodrigo, who's going to be here later. You can't do community if you're not plugged into community. So creating those connections, those networking, I think is crucial for a good ministry and to serve a community better. So that's one thing that I'm trying to be intentional on, and I guess it's part of the listening process too, but it feels more like action once you identify those.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's in front of us as church is changing is, the impact of the future of church economics, which is, we're all coming to recognize that we have less and less being able to depend on, just the giving of and offering and tithes of our current participants. But it's what you're describing is way deeper than just an economic issue. Right. It's truly come back to your original thing, which is building community. And community also includes people outside of, what we even envision as our faith circle, that emerges, and that faith circle should be one of those participants in the community around us to embed ourselves with the community and to be dependent on them in the hopes that maybe they'll start to see what God's doing, whether they recognize it as God or not, but even to begin to be dependent on, what your faith community is beginning to offer.
And I think this step is actually quite reconciling and healing for the church, because I do think the church has a place in society and has a social responsibility that we have mainly failed to uphold. And one of the markers of post-Christendom is that we need to acknowledge that there are people who are doing our jobs better than we are. And that can be humbling, and it should be. But I think it's part of reframing who we are as a church and maybe reintroducing ourselves to society of saying, you're actually doing what I'm supposed to be doing, but you're doing it better. So I want to empower you and help you in any way that I can so we can do mission together. I think it's humbling to see other people caring for the widows and the orphans in the way that we should have been. Mm-hmm. And that should lead to repentance, not to shame. Like that's not the point here. We've done enough of that in terms of inclusion and racial divisions and things that we've actually hurt more than we have helped. We need to get over ourselves a little bit and repent and move forward and partner with people.
As we kind of close up our conversation, we talked a good bit of theory and steps and practice. How about telling me about, a story or about one person, both within, your current congregation as you're trying to help them get ready for this new thing that's coming. And then tell me about somebody that you've connected with that's outside, of the current faith community that embodies what you've been talking about.
I have a good answer for this one because I just happened in my living room yesterday night. There's a couple in our church, and the girl is deeply connected to the church, like she was on the search team that hired me. And her husband is not, he kind of comes to church, but he's not really, he'll ask her like, are we going to church today? Like he's not the type of dude who's just like, oh, let's go to church. He doesn't feel like it's his church yet. And he's Mexican and she's American and they're married. And to me, just the way that their relationship works is fascinating because there's a constant in-betweenness that they both live in. And they're both trying to understand each other in crazy ways all the time. And whenever they're with us and we're hanging out and we're talking about things like food, there's always kind of shock of like, what do you mean you eat like this or you do this or you're used to this? And I think that tension that they embody in many ways, it's a beautiful, I don't know if marker, but it's a beautiful representation of what I think the church should look like. Church is a place where I think you get to hang out with people that you wouldn't hang out with if you had a choice or by your own choosing, but just getting to know them and their passions and their expectations of what to find in the church has been very encouraging for me. And yeah, I think they embody what the future is going to look like in terms of multi-ethnicity.
Metrics tell us that in the not too distant future, what they're starting to call now third culture, which is, not monoculture, but that most of our marriages and married couples are going to be, they are building the third culture right now. My son is adopted. He's Mexican American. His wife is Caribbean American, Jamaican American, and, their kids are going to definitely, be multicultural, and more, that's what's coming. It's going to be it's not a small movement within our culture and our country. So,
and it's fascinating when they talk about like mundane things like going to parties where they're like, well, for us, it's difficult to go to parties because if we go to this one party, we need to kind of like act white. And if we go to this other party, we need to act Mexican. And it's like etiquette, right? Like culture demands a certain behavior. And you think the church is free from that, but it's kind of the same thing. So for the church, it's just a really interesting experience. And I think that's one of the reasons why they're excited about my role at the church, because we're, when can we be ourselves, and can we do that at church? Can we create a place in church where we can just be, rather than try to fit into whatever mold?
Yeah, that's cool. And so how about somebody that you're beginning to interact with that's outside of your current church community that you're beginning to connect with and following these strategies of, looking for what God's already doing and, actively listening for their story? Tell us about one of those folks that you're interacting with.
Yeah, I've met a couple of people like that. And there's one in particular that I've been just praying for and thinking of. And like on paper, this is a classic story of an immigrant who came here, started working, kept working, and will continue to work for a long time, and has been pretty successful at doing it. And my introduction to this person was sort of like, I'm sorry you're going to hang out with this person because the conversation is going to be terrible. But my conversation was fascinating, and it was mainly about soccer. For like 80 minutes of our time, we just talked about soccer. And then for the last 20 minutes, he said, so when are you going to invite me to church? I said, I'm not going to invite you to church. I mean, I go to church and you're welcome to come, but that's not what I'm talking with you. I really want to get to know you. But the hunger that this person had to learn more, I discovered it wasn't as much as, are you inviting me to church? It was more of, am I welcome in your church? Which I really resonated with the anxiety that he was feeling in terms of, can I connect with what you're doing? And how can I do that? And this is a non-Christian person who to my understanding, is not really even what you would consider spiritual. But I think there's, and this is where like post-Christianism would allow us to do a lot of crazy things, that it resets the bar and it resets the meter. And I think our people around us are still looking for some purpose, for something to calm their anxiety and the meaninglessness that we live in, that we find on the Twitter feed all the time. So just learning about, his job and his experiences and just how we share so much common ground has been encouraging, and how I think I can do ministry best. But yeah, Docker, that'll get you there when it's talking to Hispanics.
So as we close, to come back to, what I said, we hope people walk away from. Can we revisit that again? You said something to the effect of, I hope we can really be focused on forming and creating and discovering what it means to be in community with each other, for folks to have a place to belong. As we close up, what do you think is going to be the most important thing for the existing church to understand about the folks who we're trying to reach, who don't really know or even care about what church is now?
That's a good question. I think that the church that is trying to not just do mission, but be a missional church in a post-Christian secular age needs to be outward focused in a way that we can create space to do community and cultivate community by invitation, not imposition, in a Jesus-centered way, because that's the way Jesus did his ministry. He invited people on. He didn't impose his beliefs on the disciples. It was more of walking with people, hearing people, pouring your life into the lives of others. And that takes time, and it takes energy, and it takes effort, and it will change your life. And if we're not willing to do that, then we're going to keep creating clubs with club membership where people can come and pay a fee and have a membership card, and that's going to be church. But if we set and define the limits of our communities in a way that can invite others who are not like us, I think we'll be transformed by the power of Jesus working in people who are not like us. Wendell Berry has a quote about doing community is defining the limits and the borders. And I think we have that power. We decide who's in, who's out. I think we are as a church at a place where we are being called to repent from how we have placed borders and walls, and how we have shrunk the doors to not let some people in. And we need to be intentional in breaking those things down and saying, this doesn't work anymore. And it actually has never worked. So takeaway, mantra, one quote, realizing that we need each other, and that I am not complete. I am not whole unless I have my brother and my sister who is not like me next to me worshiping together. And that I need that person to see Jesus through that person's eyes, because I think Jesus works in and through us. It's an invitation, I think, not just to transform people, but to be transformed by people, to allow those stories to change who I am and how I think and how I believe and how I worship. That's what I hope the church can look like, and the type of church that I want to be a part of, a church that is well aware that this is not about me. It's about Jesus and it's about each other. I'm hoping that we can learn to love God more so we can love each other more.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the ministry you're doing and for helping us to discover, what church might start to look like next, and giving us a couple of real tangible ways that the church is changing. And it's not that we don't like change. It's we struggle with the changing itself and what we've got to give up and what we have to lose in order to gain. But then again, Jesus said, hey, if you want to live, you got to die. You want to give it up, you got to set it all aside. You got to lose your life to gain it. So I'm hearing a little bit of echoes of that in your words. And that's not an ominous thing. I think that's a hopeful thing. We still have this potential and possibility of church making a difference in the world around us. And thanks for being a part of experimenting with that and trying to help us figure that out, what that looks like next. Really enjoyed being with you today. Look forward to hearing from you again soon.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. It's always a good conversation, bro.
Thank you for listening to Means of Grace, a podcast produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. We hope you enjoy listening to these podcasts and use them as a way to stay connected to our community. Remember to subscribe to Means of Grace for free on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave us an honest rating and a review. It helps others find this podcast. Follow the WNCC on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at WNCCUMC. Once again, that's at WNCCUMC. Means of Grace is produced by the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and Andy Go of Gojo Studios.